This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Go to our website at wdtatpodcast.com and click on support to learn how you can be part of this effort to learn how to have better conversations, increase compassion, and build bridges, not walls. You can make a one-time donation or become a patron for as little as $1 a month and receive patron-only benefits. Thanks to all of our patrons at any level for your support. We really couldn't do this without you. Now let's get into the interview. As we inaugurate a new president, it's a good time to talk about important questions about change, activism, and dialogue. Joanna Lawrence Shenk joins us to discuss activism, getting to know our neighbors, and whether or not dialogue really changes anything. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Joanna Lawrence Shenk. She is the associate pastor at First Mennonite Church of San Francisco and the co-producer of the Iconicast podcast. She's author of 2 books, The Movement Makes Us Human, an interview with Dr. Vincent Harding on Mennonites, Vietnam, and MLK, and Widening the Circle, Experiments in Christian Discipleship. Currently, she lives in San Francisco's Mission District with her family, and she participates in local activism with Faith in Action Bay Area, focused on creating a city where everyone belongs. She's committed also to learning the history of the Bay Area and honoring the original peoples, including, I know I'm going to mispronounce these, so I apologize to indigenous people, these particular indigenous people, but the Ramaytush, Tamian, Chochenyo, Karkin, and Bay Miwok, who continue to care for the land today. I don't know, how did I do, Joanna? Did I butcher those or not?
No, that was good. It's Ramaytush. The first one is Ramaytush.
Okay,
yes,
awesome.
The others, yeah.
Yeah, I was really glad to include that. And welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm glad that we finally found a time to chat.
Yeah, definitely. So, first of all, did you grow up Mennonite?
Yes and no. So
Okay.
Both of my parents did. And as a kid, I didn't identify as Mennonite. I identified as non-denominational, charismatic evangelical.
Yeah.
Although the church that my dad pastored was a part of the Ohio Mennonite Conference at the time.
Okay.
It's not anymore. But yeah, I had my critiques as a kid of Mennonites and thought that they didn't care enough about their relationship with Jesus. And so, just didn't see a spiritual vitality there. Like when I would go to visit my grandparents' churches that I found in the congregation where I grew up. So it's been an interesting journey for me. I do identify as Mennonite now, but it definitely has been, a journey to get to that.
I only ask because I'm also Mennonite and know lots of Mennonites, but I didn't grow up Mennonite. So I'm always curious kind of to know how people ended up Mennonite or if they grew up Mennonite. And there's a lot, as you already kind of touched on, there's lots of dynamics there. And for those that, maybe don't know, Mennonites are a traditional peace church, and that looks very different, as you're kind of pointing out in your story about being Mennonite, growing up around Mennonites. So I'm curious, growing up at least around and influenced by Mennonites and pacifists, what did you learn about conflict growing up? Both maybe what was explicitly taught and then also, maybe what you saw or kind of absorbed also about conflict.
Yeah. Well, I'll go two directions with this. First, I'll say that I just assumed as a kid that all Christians were pacifist because it just was what Jesus said. So it was a real shock to me, even though I grew up in charismatic evangelical spaces. My parents were both committed pacifists, and my dad was, the pastor of the church. So I just thought, well, all Christians must believe this, that we're called to love our enemies, to not participate in war. And so it was the real shocker as I grew up to find that the pacifist Christian position was actually in the minority. And I found that quite troubling. Yeah. So that's kind of one answer to the question. The other answer would be in my family and what I saw modeled around conflict. My thinking was good people don't have conflict. So conflict is bad and it's someone's fault. And so if there's conflict, someone did something wrong. And so we want to, avoid conflict at all costs. So it definitely was a process for me to come into like a different understanding of conflict, because what I grew up with, was just seeing conflict as a really negative thing. And my parents in their relationship really didn't have overt conflict. Like I can remember once in my childhood when they were mad at each other, but they never yelled at each other. Like I didn't have any models of like how to do conflict well. It was just like conflict is bad. So don't have it.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful because even, among Mennonites who spend a lot of time probably talking about peace and even conflict resolution, it's important to remember, like, we still get very mixed messages growing up, and even people who are you would think kind of have more would have more to teach. We still have really weird relationships with conflict. We're different ways to avoid it, even as pacifists and as Mennonites.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember like there's a really clear moment for me in seminary. I went to Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, and I was in an ethics class that was taught by Regina Shan Stoltzfus, who's a biblical scholar and teaches at Goshen College. But if people don't know who Regina Shan Stoltzfus is, you should look her up because she's done some amazing work within the Mennonite Church, especially around undoing racism. But anyway, she was teaching the class, and I remember we were having a discussion in class, and it hit me in such a clear way that, like, if I actually was to be committed to peace and to the way of Jesus and to living ethically, that I would get into a lot more conflict. That actually walking in the way of Jesus in this world would put me at odds and in conflict in a lot of different ways. And it was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And yet, given like my formation and how I grew up, like it was like an illumination in that moment too, that I see as like a real shift in my paradigm around conflict, as at that point I was in my mid-20s. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's a great segue to telling us a little bit more about how you got involved in activism, right? Because I think that's what people think about when they think about activism, like stirring up conflict maybe, or like causing conflict, bringing those things to the fore and saying, okay, we're going to have to like challenge and fight about this and make change, right? So what's your story? What's your journey getting involved in activism?
So I'll give some of my story, and then I want to talk about the word activism, because that in and of itself is a really interesting designation, sure, like what it implies and also what it negates. So we'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of my own experience, so my time in seminary was really pivotal for me in my formation. And I would say kind of in my coming of age, like in my growing up. Like I said, I was in my mid 20s when I was at seminary. And one of the things that I did in seminary was I took a class on family systems theory, which is offered in seminary both for people to think about their own families of origin, but as people are considering going into pastoral ministry, thinking about how they can support people in their congregations who are working through difficult things in their past, and thinking about how, they've been formed by their families of origin. So it was a really helpful class that opened me up to things that to that point I hadn't really been able to process related to my own family, or related to what I had been taught. Like, what does it mean to be a good person in the world? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be white? Had I even been taught anything explicitly about that? There were just all of these things that came up. And along with the other things that I was learning in seminary. And I also had the end of my first serious relationship. And so there was this way that, like, everything that I had kind of anticipated for my life, or the foundation that I had in terms of how I made sense of my identity in the world, just kind of like was crumbling. It was like disintegrating. And I was like, okay, what is the foundation that I need, to be able to navigate the world in a more adult way? And so there were a number of things that really supported me in kind of that, like, creating a new foundation. One was conversations that I had with friends who were asking similar questions, and other classes that I was taking at seminary, but really, the questions that were coming up were around, like, all these different pieces of my identity, like what it means to be a woman, what it meant to grow up relatively middle class, to be white. And as I was living in a Mennonite voluntary service house at the time, which is an intentional community, and my housemates were all asking the same questions. And this was in 2008 when the recession hit, and we were living in a neighborhood in Elkhart, Indiana, that got super impacted by the recession because of the fallout with the RV industry that's in Elkhart. A lot of people were losing their homes. They were losing their jobs, they were losing their homes. And in the household, we were saying, what does it mean for us to be here now? Like, not just to help people, but like, how is our liberation connected to the liberation of all? And so it really reoriented me towards this idea that, like, I'm not going to be free until everyone else is free. Like, that my liberation is connected to the liberation of others, and others that I've kind of been taught to see as other, rather than like as my people or a part of my community. And so living in that household, in that neighborhood, in that time, and going to seminary really raised these questions like, well, how do I want to be showing up in the world right now? And so it wasn't for me a question of like, what are the issues that I want to get involved with? Like, how do I want to be an activist? It was more like, I know that I need to be liberated from whiteness, from white supremacy, from all of the things that I've been taught that keep me separated from people and out of community. I know that I need that, and I can learn that through relationship with others that have had very different life experiences than me. And so it was like coming into, I guess, a commitment to activism was about like my own need for healing and for wholeness and for liberation.
Yeah. So I want to hear what you think about the word activism now, and like what you do and don't like. I struggle too with a better term to sort of talk about people that are engaged in organizing and making change and that kind of grassroots work. But yeah, what do you like or not like about activism?
Yeah, so I'm going to reference a book by Jonathan Matthew Smucker, definitely another person that people should or could look up. The book's called Hegemony How To. and the subtitle is A Roadmap for Radicals. And in the book, he he asked some really interesting questions about the word activism. And so I want to quote a little bit from what he wrote because it's so clear, and then interested for us just to discuss it a bit. So one of the things he writes is that the label activist marks a contentless distinction between the active social change participant and the society. So it's kind of like, well, there's this group of people who like do a thing over here, and then there's everybody else. So like you're an activist or you're not an activist. And as we know, it can be a really negative thing, like, oh, those crazy activists, they're just out in the street again or whatever. Or it can be like, this is my community. Like, we're an activist community. We're standing up for what's right. But it's always creating this really stark distinction between the people who are a part of it and the people who aren't a part of it. And interestingly, one of the notes that he has in the book is that the word activist was used first. It was used to describe people in Sweden who advocated for getting involved in World War I. And it was intended to counter the label pacifist, which I think is just so fascinating.
Interesting. Yeah, that is super fascinating and new to me. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I didn't know that either. So he goes on, and there's a number of pages about this. And so that's part of why I recommend his book, Hegemony How To. And he sees it like the term activist also kind of can allow people to just self-select into a niche of like, well, this is my issue. This is what I care about. This is what I'm going to organize about. I'm going to connect with these people who are all caring about the same thing. And in a sense, it's like, yes, the advocacy is good. It's important. We need to raise our voices around a lot of different issues. But what it doesn't do is invite like the whole society into democratic engagement, into being aware and committed to societal change. It kind of just makes it a specialization, just like we have, everybody's specialized. We have people who work in finance and people who, are teachers, and like everyone just kind of has their own little specialization, and activist is another specialization. But to actually transform society, to create the society we need, it's like everyone needs to be engaged. Like it has to be way more broad-based than I think what we've allowed it to become. Or it also is just a hobby. It's like, well, I'll do my activism in my free time, or like I won't bring my activism into my job because that would be alienating. And again, it just allows for it to be, in this silo off by itself, rather than this kind of holistic engagement with the transformation of society. Yeah.
I imagine it also making it kind of a specialization or something, that a label that people have makes it so that you can kind of say, well, there are activists that will do that work, and therefore I don't necessarily have to. I mean, maybe I'll donate, but I'm not going to get involved in doing the work, because there are people who are doing that. Those are activists, and they're out there and they're doing it so that I don't have to. And I like what you're saying, is that we're all, if we want to make the world a better place, we're all involved in that process, and there's not a separate special group of people that are going to do it for us.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. One of the things that I remember Vincent Harding talking about a lot, Dr. Vincent Harding, who was a friend of Martin Luther King Jr. and a tireless advocate for justice and really for people to be educated in a way that compelled them to create the society that we need. He so often talked about democracy and democratic process. And I think, 10 years ago or so, I was like, well, what exactly does that mean? Like, the United States is considered a democracy, but it doesn't really function that way. And, maybe that isn't the best model. But what, now as I think back and as I've continued to grow in my own learnings and awareness, I think what he was really saying is like, we need a society where everyone is participating in the bettering of society, in the transformation of society. So like, it's not big capital D democracy. It's about really claiming our voice as people in the shaping of the society we need, rather than expecting the professional activists to do it, or expecting the politicians or whoever we pin our hopes on. What he was saying is like, we all need to be participating and really invested in what our community needs. And one example that I've told in a few different spaces that came out of my experience with him that I think so clearly illustrates this commitment was when he was visiting Elkhart, Indiana, where I was living at the time. And he was visiting over MLK celebrations. It was in January, and he was there for a week speaking in different places and holding conversations. And I had coordinated the itinerary for him and was picking him up and taking him to the different things. And so we had a lot of time in the car to talk. And so one day we were, I had picked him up and we were going to the seminary. We were going to Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. I was no longer a student there, but I was still very connected and working for the denomination at that time. And so he said to me as we were driving to that venue, so, you know, what do you think would be helpful for me to talk about today, you know, with your community? And I said something like, you know, we're just grateful, you know, to hear whatever wisdom you would like to share with us. You know, we're so glad that you've taken the time to come and be here. And I know people are just really interested to hear your thoughts. And he like paused for a second. He was always very deliberate in his speaking. And then he said to me, he said, Joanna, this is your community and you need to tell me what your community needs, you know, and then I can speak to that.
Yeah.
You know,
Whoa.
And he said a few other things too, but he was just like, no, take responsibility, step up and tell me what it is that you need, because you know, I don't know. I'm coming from the outside. Like, I'm not just an authority that can come in and tell you what to do. Like, I need to hear from you, you know, what you need and what you're working on. And so that's another really formative experience for me, and something kind of like a hinge moment where I really got what he was talking about and was kind of like, you know, like kind of took a deep breath myself and sat up a little bit straighter. And then I did have something to say. It's like, I did know how to answer that question when I gave myself a minute to think about it.
Yeah, it makes me think of it's like kind of the flip side of that specialization. Another example, right? Like bringing in a speaker who has all this incredible experience and wisdom to share, and just say like, well, just share with us sort of abstractly your thoughts and musings on everything. And the real wisdom was that nugget of, no, I need to speak to your community. And you know, when you were talking about small d democracy and this idea of what Dr. Harding was saying about getting everyone to participate is really what that's about. It made me think about my own community and local government, and that raises so many questions. Like, if we really, really want everyone to participate, then we have to start thinking about why people don't participate, right? So if we're having city council meetings and nobody cares and nobody shows up, why don't they show up? What time are the meetings? You know, what transportation do people need? People are in poverty and just don't have the time for engaging local politics or things like that. So all of a sudden, now you have all these things you need to start thinking about and wrestling with if you really are wanting that small d democracy to get people participating. It's a little bit daunting, I think, but it's also really gets to kind of the meat of what that work is about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think like one group that has been organizing and advocating along these lines for the last decade is the Poor People's Campaign. a national call for a moral revival, and they've been doing things all over the country, and are really committed to a movement to end poverty led by the poor. Because I think part of, like what you're getting at, Lucas, is that there's a swath of people in the country, and in most cases white people, who think, well, things aren't working fairly well, or like it's working well enough for me. Like I have a job, I have a home, like I'm doing okay. I can generally trust, the authorities, the governing authorities. They look like me, the police don't treat me badly. Like it's okay, and so there isn't this sense, there isn't this connection to those who really are suffering, or there's just a kind of a blinder, or like ways that we justify why people are suffering, or why things are so hard for some communities when they're not for us. And so I think part of the antidote is being in relationships across difference, and across the ways that we've been kind of divided against each other in society, especially anyone who isn't, the 1%, like we have a lot more in common with each other, whether someone is, without a home and living on the street, or someone owns a home. Like the distance between those two is a lot closer than any connection that we have to, say, the Walton family who owns Walmart, or to the folks that are making, buku bucks on Wall Street, or to Jeff Bezos. It's like, yeah, our solidarity is with the people who are on the street, not with the wealthy white people who are running things. But we haven't been taught that. Like there isn't that sense of solidarity or connection, I think, between people who see themselves in a relatively middle class reality and people who are in poverty, but like we're really close to each other in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, it's like, what does it also look like to build those relationships and make those connections where we're not just constantly with like-minded people in the exact same social location, which is what activists can do too. We can just get into our little groups, and we're not actually creating enough power to change systems. We might win a thing here or there, but it's not actually like transforming society.
Yeah. Well, that segues really nicely because, the theme of this podcast is having difficult conversations, and some of that means talking about things we avoid talking about, and you've mentioned a lot of those things already that we don't like talking about. The fact that we have more in common with people who we think of as different than us than the 1%, but and then in terms of like how we have the conversations, I think is one of the things I hope people get the most out of this podcast, because we just don't have those skills. And what you're talking about is building relationships with people in your community that are your neighbors, that are around you, that you just don't know and you haven't taken the time to get to know. And you may find out like you have some common ground and then you really don't on some other areas. So talk about what the role of dialogue and having those hard conversations is in doing that kind of work that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a lot of different ways to go with it. And so I'll just speak coming out of my experience here in the city. So as you mentioned in the intro, one of the ways that I'm involved is with a group called Faith in Action Bay Area that is seeking to create a city where everyone belongs. And Faith in Action Bay Area currently is made up of Spanish speakers and English speakers. And so almost all of our meetings, and now our meetings are virtual, but prior to that too, all of our meetings were translated between Spanish and English. And I don't speak Spanish. I can understand some. I mean, I've actually learned a lot more since I've gotten involved with Faith in Action. But having like the translation as a really like central part of our work makes it possible for building these relationships across lines of difference where otherwise we couldn't, be in conversation with each other or hear each other's stories. So some of how that happened, like it hasn't always been that way. So I'll try to outline this really briefly, but there had been a group of mostly white clergy who were wanting to do advocacy around housing justice in the city. Just because San Francisco is one of the most expensive places to live and people are getting pushed out all the time. And so it's like, what is the role of the faith community in speaking out against this and saying, this is unjust and immoral, what we see happening. And at the same time, there was another group of Spanish-speaking elders connected to Faith in Action who were realizing that the quote unquote affordable housing that was being built for seniors in the neighborhood where I live, the Mission, actually wasn't affordable, that low income seniors couldn't even afford affordable housing. And so they're like, you've got to be kidding me, because they had been organizing for years to get affordable senior housing for themselves and their neighbors. And so a couple of the organizers in Faith in Action were talking, and they were like, we need to bring these groups together, the mostly white clergy or faith leaders, and the Spanish speaking elders who have been working on this. And we need to be advocating together, in this case, for subsidies so that seniors could actually, afford the affordable housing, or afford to stay in the housing that they had. And so what it did was for me and for other clergy, put us in conversation with longtime residents in the city who were very connected to folks who were being evicted, even, more so than I was. I mean, people in my congregation, First Mennonite Church, would leave the city, but it wasn't really ever because they got evicted and couldn't afford it anymore. It was more like they decided that, they wanted to buy a house in the Midwest. They couldn't afford to buy a house here, or they were seeking educational opportunities somewhere else. So they were leaving because it was expensive, but they weren't getting like pushed out. They weren't getting kicked out in the same way, that I was hearing from my Spanish speaking neighbors. And so it was through that shared work together and building relationships together, like, because you can't do the work without building the relationships, that it's like I started to think of them and them of me as, like family and as community and people, that we weren't only, organizing with, but we were praying for each other, and we were supporting each other in, other things that were happening in our lives. And back before COVID started, I would be walking down the street in my neighborhood, and then I'd run into some of the senoras who are a part of the organizing. And even though we couldn't speak very much to each other because they didn't really speak English and I didn't speak Spanish, it's like we could say hello and how are you doing? And it just was like, yeah, these are my neighbors. This is my community. And were it not for doing this shared work together, we would have continued to just pass each other on the street. And, I would have assumed, here's, an elder in the community that I can't relate to because, they're probably Spanish speaking and I don't know what to say. And they would say, oh, here's a young white person who probably just moved here a couple years ago and doesn't really care about, this neighborhood or understand, what people are facing. But it's like that doesn't have to be the reality if we are finding ways to join together. And I think that really, like, related to what I was saying with the Poor People's Campaign, that we need to follow the lead of those who are closest to the pain. Like the people who are experiencing poverty are the ones who know what needs to change. Like they're the experts. And so often I think people with a certain amount of privilege think that they're coming with the answers because they have a college or education or a master's degree or, whatever, rather than saying like, no, the people that I really need to learn from and follow the lead of are those, that are really on like the edge and experiencing this injustice firsthand.
Yeah, knowing when to listen, and how important listening is in understanding. And it's a theme that comes up a lot on this podcast. How much we need to learn to be silent, especially those of us who have a lot of privilege. It's something that we've sort of been taught. We don't have to be silent, or we don't have to listen, that we kind of know it, and can tell other people what we already know, instead of listening to learn, as you're saying, from those who have expertise just because of their closeness to those situations. So in the last, really, it's probably 5 or 6 years. I mean, maybe it seems different to you, like this, it feels like there's this resurgence of like protest and movement and marches, going all the way back to Michael Brown and the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement. We're real comfortable when we see the civil rights era sort of pictures of marches, and we feel good about those. Growing up, I kind of felt, oh wow, that's cool. They really made big change, or watching Ben Kingsley play Gandhi or something. And then I feel like in my life there was this sort of period, not that protests didn't happen necessarily, but they weren't on the news. Like, I didn't know anything about protests that were happening for a long time growing up through the 80s and 90s. And I know there were lots of, protests during the 90s, but just, you'd see little blips on the news, but not much, right? Not the way we've, 2020 maybe more than other recent years, but protest has been so much more prevalent and covered, like in the zeitgeist, in the air. And there are other things I think that are contributing to making it hard to have conversations across. I don't think protest is what's making it hard to have conversations, political dialogue. I guess my question for you is, when we're trying to raise awareness and do the kind of work that you and I are talking about to make change, to make the world better for everybody, especially for those who are having a lot harder time than you and me, when do we get in the streets and protest? And then when do we dialogue with, say, Republicans or people who disagree with us about a particular issue, or I struggle with that, and I think you could really shed some light on where we're at in terms of being able to talk to people that we really, really disagree with, and then the role of dialogue versus protest. Is that just another episode? Should we pause and then start over?
Right. Yeah, you could definitely take a lot of time unpacking all of that. One thing I would say is there definitely are limits to dialogue. I don't think that dialogue is always the best way to go. And sometimes I think, especially for like Mennonite people, or folks who are more liberal, it's like, well, if people just had the right information, then they would think the right things, then they would change their mind. Right. But it's like, no, that's actually not really like that doesn't necessarily work. Like, maybe it works for some people, but just presenting, a clear argument isn't necessarily going to convince anyone. And we're also living in an age where truth is not even seen as valuable, or, it's like everyone kind of just has their own truth, or everything is your opinion. And so I don't even think that like societally we have an agreement across lines of difference about there being objective truth. And I don't even mean like that in a Christian, like absolute truth, whatever kind of way. I just mean like people can come to a contentious conversation with two incredibly different ways of thinking, and they're never going to find a common ground, because of their ideology or, just what they're committed to. So there can be limits to dialogue. Like, I don't think that dialogue is what will save us. Although at times it can be useful, I think a big question is around power. Like, what does it mean to build power to create changes that are needed? And so if we look back historically, one thing that we can say of like the religious right and folks who have been connected to that in its different iterations since, like, I don't know exactly when it started, the 80s. Like, it definitely was going strong in the 80s. I remember that as a kid, but like they were able to really build a lot of power to have, issues that across the board people were committed to, and to also like have an ideology, like a worldview that really backed it up, and there still is a lot of power in kind of conservative evangelical, but it's not just Christians who think this way, but the religious right and the right did a great job of getting themselves organized and getting people on the same page. And so when they hear, certain words, or certain issues, it's like they're totally supportive, like they're totally there. And so, like we see with the election, for some people, they may really not like Trump as a person, but because of his stance on abortion, they'll vote for him because that is the most important thing, and that's about organizing, and that's about power, and that's about creating a narrative about the world, that people can get behind. And so one of the questions that I think is really important for people who are committed to undoing racism, committed to the transformation of economic systems that are exploitative, is like, how are we building power to actually change what's happening? Like, it's not just about convincing people to think a certain way, but it's actually about power to get people, and organizations in positions where things can change. So if we actually wanted a redistribution of wealth in this country, we would have to have policymakers in place at all levels that agreed that that is what would create more human flourishing. But of course, we don't have that kind of power because, someone like Bernie Sanders, who was just barely, suggesting small changes, was just totally, thrown out the window, by the liberal elites. Yeah. It was like, nope, we're not going to create space for that. So yeah, I think this question of power is a really interesting one. And dialogue is maybe a small piece of that, but it's really about how do we build power as people to create the society we need? Because, liberals are going to pay lip service to all kinds of things that I want and feel good about. But when it actually comes to changing structures, like, it takes power. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I really appreciate you challenging the entire premise of my podcast, because it's great because it does. It's more fodder for needing to think about, like, just being able to have a good conversation is not necessarily the be all end all. It might be important and a skill that we've lost, but it doesn't necessarily save the world. So I appreciate that. And I also appreciated what you were saying. Some people might react to your comment about Bernie Sanders, but I think what's really important is the ways that we have narrowed what we're willing to talk about. It seems like it's so narrow that it's hard to have conversations about, well, what economic system do we think would be great, or what things would make the world a better place, and like willing to talk about socialism or, like all of these scary words that that we don't say and we're not going to talk about. So I appreciate that. Joanna, I'm going to have you back on because I feel like there's so much more we need to talk about dialogue and conflict and protest. But we do have to wrap up. So I wrap up with two things, a going out and a going deeper. Going out is like a action step that we want to leave people with. I think it's a perfect episode for action steps. And going deeper, you've recommended a couple different books that I'll include in the show notes. But any other resources, movies, books, other podcasts, anything that you want to recommend? I'll start and give you a little bit of time. My going out for this conversation goes back to Dr. Harding's question. I really, really liked what you shared about him coming to AMBS and saying, well, what does your community need me to talk to you about? And so I want to leave listeners with that question as a challenge. If Dr. Harding came to your community and you wanted to hear his wisdom for how to make change and how to do the kind of work that we're talking about, how would you answer his question? Do you know what needs there are in your community? Do you know how you would answer that? And I think a lot of us don't. There's a lot of people that are, just living day to day and work in their jobs and don't know what are the needs around me in my community. So hopefully that challenges us to learn more. Maybe it's just reading your local paper and paying more attention to what's happening in your local government, but we can take that action so that we have an answer to Dr. Harding's question. I think that's really important. If you don't have an answer to that, go figure out how to find out what your answer would be. Going deeper, oh man. Well, I'm adding your books that you mentioned to the list, well, I'll recommend, this is a plug for you, the Iconicast podcast. I know you guys aren't right now as active as you used to be, but the archive for the Iconicast is fantastic. There are so many incredible interviews, going so much deeper on a lot of things that Joanna has already talked about and touched on. I highly, highly, highly recommend that podcast if you want to dig into more of what we've been talking about today. So, okay, I'll throw to you. What's your going out and your going deeper?
Yes. Okay. So going out, I would say, kind of building on what you were offering, is if folks aren't familiar with the Poor People's Campaign, to check that out and to also sit with that premise that they put forward, that the movement to end poverty needs to be led by the poor. Like, how does that strike you, and what comes up as you ponder that statement? So I would say, check out what the Poor People's Campaign is doing. They're all across the country, so there probably is, some city near you where folks are organizing. And also look at the history of the Poor People's Campaign, because, and maybe this is a bit of the going deeper piece, but this was the last big effort of Martin Luther King Jr. before he was assassinated, was to create the Poor People's Campaign. So this isn't a new thing. This is, already 50 years in the making, and really at the heart of what I think Dr. King believed was the transformation that we needed in society. And then for going deeper, one book that I highly recommend that I haven't mentioned yet is by Dr. Vincent Harding. It's called There is a River, The Black Struggle for Freedom in America. He wrote this it came out in the 80s, and I read it in the last 6 months, I think, and it brought me to tears a few different times. It was just one of the most amazing books I've ever read. And what he does in this book is he talks about Black resistance to enslavement from the very beginning, from the shores of Africa, from the African continent up through the Civil War era is the scope of the book. But it is just amazing. It is so inspiring to hear story after story of people who refused to be treated as less than, who refused, the abuse that they were receiving at the hands of the white supremacy in America, and all that this country has engendered along those lines. And you might think, oh, that sounds really heavy, but it's amazing. I mean, he's a historian and he's a poet, and like these stories are so powerful. And I think for people who are committed to transformation today and committed to justice, it is such a witness to the power of the human spirit and human communities to resist oppression and to really claim their dignity and their freedom, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. So I highly recommend that book. There is a River, the Black Struggle for Freedom in America. And I think, yes, it will offer folks a lot of hope and inspiration in these days.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And I'll include, everything that you've mentioned and talked about in the show notes. Is there anything you want to plug before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Like I said, the Poor People's Campaign is active. It's an ongoing movement. And so just really encouraging folks to get involved, or at least to look at that as a framework for what it means to work for transformation in society today.
All right. Joanna, thank you so much for spending time talking to us today. And hopefully we'll get to talk to you again.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Thank you so much. It's been great to be in conversation.
Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Hope Fellowship Mennonite Church for their generous support of the podcast. Also, many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?
Que le vaya bien.
A That's Not Canon Productions podcast.